Dairy is once again at the center of Canada-U.S. trade tensions. Canada is going to officially begin talks with the U.S. in January. These are to review and potentially make changes to CUSMA. Now, the White House is already laying out conditions Canada must meet to keep this existing deal, and one of the biggest flashpoints.
To ensure long-term certainty of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement, the United States is calling for sweeping changes within the dairy market.
The United States has been asking for a number of things from Canada's dairy industry for a long time.
Here's the problem with Canada. We're spending hundreds of billions a year to protect it. We don't need the cars. We don't need their lumber.
The intensity of Donald Trump's attacks on Canada may be stronger than ever.
They expected Canada to bend. They expected quiet concessions, careful language, and a slow walk backward to keep Washington calm. Instead, they got a single sentence, and with it, a shift that most people still don't understand. When Mark Carney stood before reporters and said supply management was not on the table, it didn't sound dramatic. There was no raised voice, no threat, no performance, just clarity. And in geopolitics, clarity is often more dangerous than confrontation. Because that sentence wasn't aimed at farmers. It wasn't aimed at trade lawyers. It was aimed at Washington. For decades, American negotiators have operated on one assumption. Canada might resist, but it will always compromise. The logic was simple. A smaller economy, deeply dependent on U.S. markets, eventually runs out of room to say no. Pressure works, time works, leverage works. This time, none of it did. The demand itself was familiar. Expanded access to Canada's dairy market, a weakening of a system that has protected Canadian food security for over 50 years. American officials framed it as fairness, as free trade, as modernization. But behind that language was something more direct: compliance. And Washington didn't just ask, it signaled. The message was clear. Without movement on dairy, broader trade cooperation would become difficult. This was leverage being applied openly, the same way it has been applied for years. What Washington misread was not the policy, it misread the moment. Carney didn't argue the economics. He didn't debate quotas. He didn't acknowledge the premise of the demand at all. He simply restated Canadian policy as settled fact. Not negotiable, not discussable. Finished. That response matters because it breaks a pattern. In previous confrontations, Canada often responded by offering partial movement, symbolic adjustments, or quiet side agreements to keep relations stable. This time there was none of that. No softening, no signal of flexibility later. Just a boundary. And boundaries are powerful when they're enforced. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what supply management represents. To American negotiators, it's a market distortion. To Canada, it's a sovereignty mechanism, a way to ensure domestic food stability, predictable rural economies, and insulation from global price shocks. But Carney's refusal wasn't really about milk. It was about precedent. Because the moment Canada accepts that Washington can force the dismantling of a domestic policy built over decades, every other policy becomes conditional. Environmental rules, digital regulations, resource management, healthcare administration, all of it becomes negotiable under pressure. Carney understands that, and so does Washington, even if it won't say so publicly. This is why the response came so fast. Less than 24 hours after the demand was framed publicly, the refusal arrived. No internal confusion, no mixed messaging. That tells you this line was drawn long before the question was asked. And it also tells you something else. Canada expected this confrontation. Over the last several years, Ottawa has quietly reduced its vulnerability. Trade diversification, European ties, Pacific partnerships, domestic industrial capacity. None of these eliminate dependence on the United States, but they reduce desperation. And desperation is what pressure tactics rely on. That's the shift most coverage will miss. Washington assumed leverage still worked the way it used to. that a threat to trade stability would force accommodation. Instead, it exposed something uncomfortable. Leverage only works if the other side believes they have no alternatives. Canada no longer believes that. From an American perspective, this creates a problem with no clean solution. Push harder, and you force Canada to harden its position further. Back off, and you signal that ultimatums don't work. Either way, authority erodes. This is why this moment matters far beyond dairy. It signals a continental relationship entering a new phase, one where Canada is no longer managing American reactions, but managing its own limits. That's a quiet but profound change, and it's not happening in isolation. This refusal fits a broader pattern: energy policy, digital platform rules, cultural protections, defense procurement. Again and again, Canada has declined to restructure domestic priorities to satisfy American commercial preferences. Politely, calmly, consistently. That consistency is what builds credibility. Every time a line is drawn and held, future demands lose force. Every time pressure fails, the cost of applying it again rises. Other countries notice this too. Power isn't just exercised, it's observed. For viewers in the United States, this moment deserves attention, not outrage. It reveals the long-term consequences of treating allies as leverage targets rather than partners. When pressure becomes a default tool, resistance eventually becomes policy. For Canada, this was not defiance, it was definition. A statement of what is Canadian decision-making and what is not. What happens next depends on Washington. Negotiations will continue. Reviews will proceed. Talks will reopen. But they will do so within new boundaries that didn't exist before this refusal. That's the real outcome here. Canada didn't end the conversation. It changed the rules of it. And in geopolitics, the side that defines the rules is rarely the weaker one.